Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name's Nicole and today I'm going to be sharing with you the 3 works of historical fiction that I read in the last couple of weeks, and this will basically be wrapping up all the books I'm going to be talking to you about in the month of January. So the first book that I have to share with you is Palace Walk. This is by Naguib Mahfouz, I believe is how you say the author's name, and this is book 1 in the Cairo trilogy. Now I have read this book before, maybe 3 years ago, but I decided to read it again because I really want to read the entire trilogy. And I made multiple attempts to do that last year, but never really got around to it because I kept feeling like I wasn't ready to move on to book 2 because I was starting to suspect that I had forgotten a lot of what happened in book 1. So at the end of 2025 in December, I was talking with Didi at Brown Girl Reading, and she mentioned wanting to read the entire trilogy in 2026, and we decided to read the whole trilogy together. So in the month of January, we decided to read Palace Walk. This was actually the first book, or around the first book, that I read in the month of January, so I'm not sure why I'm not talking about it until now. I don't know. I'm not going to think about that because that'll just like be too confusing for me. Like I mentioned, this is the first book in a trilogy, and this was first published in 1906. This book is set just after World War I ends. It takes place in Egypt that is currently occupied by the British, and Egypt itself as a nation is on the verge of seeking its own independence. And during this story, you are invited into the Al-Jawad family, and you get to spend time with all of the members of the family, from the eldest member of the family, which is the father, all 5 of the children, as well as the mother, Amina. And this is definitely a family story and a family saga. It talks about family roles. It talks about the hypocrisy and patriarchy that it could exist in the families at the time. It is a Muslim family that we are following, and there is a lot of discussion of duty. One of the things that I did learn while reading this book and looking at an introduction to it is that this book was actually inspired by John Galsworthy's The Forsyte Saga. And I did read the Forsyte Saga in the month of January. I won't have a review on that out until February. But as soon as I started reading The Man of Property, which is book 1 in that series, I instantly recognized that there was a similarity between these 2 books. And so when I read the introduction of this one, I was not surprised to find that this was actually inspired by that book. So I can already tell you, if you like the Forsyte Saga, you very well may like this series as well, even though there are some differences between the 2 of them. The highs for me in this book, and particularly in the reread of this book, was I again loved just the deep character study that was done here. I really liked the character development and the character arc as well. I think one of the things that made the biggest difference to me on a reread was I kind of knew what to expect from the book. The first time I read this book, one of the major lows for me was I found it difficult to get into, not because of the plot or the pacing, but just because one of the first characters we're introduced to, I really did not like. I'm so glad that I stuck with it that time because I ended up really enjoying the rest of the book and came to terms with what was going on with that initial character that I didn't like. And taking that knowledge with me into a reread of this book made it so much easier to enjoy and get into. I think the only low in this book is really just that it can be hard to get into because there is a very unlikable main character. But again, if you know that going into it, that can definitely help you overcome that. I gave this book 4.5 stars, which is a whole star up from what I gave it last time. I really did enjoy it a lot more. I was way more invested in getting to know the family. There were things that I picked up that I didn't notice the first time that I was able to concentrate on this time, and it was just a really smooth, fast read for me. I would recommend this book to anybody who likes historical fiction, who, like I said, likes a Forsyte Saga, who likes books that are about culture and customs and the particular values within a family, and who likes books that are like a slice of life. You spend a lot of time with this family on just a day-to-day basis, getting to know and see what their daily routine is like. So if you like those kind of stories, this may be a book for you. Other books that this reminds me of, other than the Forsyte Saga, is Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. I'm also reminded of A House for Mr. Biswas, though I would say that book is maybe a little bit more lighthearted. And this also reminds me in some ways of A Suitable Boy. All of those are stories that have to do with families, and there is a lot of their own particular culture and beliefs and value systems in those books, and I think they're all enjoyable for very similar reasons. So I mentioned that all three books that I'm talking about today are works of historical fiction, but one of the things I'm just realizing is that two of the three books are actually parts of series. And I am proud to say that this next book completes a series for me. So yay to complete a series in the first month of the year. And that book is Ghost Road by Pat Barker. This is book 3 in the Regeneration series, which I started only just last year. It is a work of historical fiction and was published in 1995. Since this is book 3 in the series, I'm not going to talk about the specifics of what goes on in this book, but I'll tell you what the series is about in whole. Basically, this series is a critique and a look at the role that society played in sort of treating and potentially condemning men during World War I, specifically in the UK, and it looks at the treatment and the consequences of the treatment of men who were in the war, men who resisted the war, as well as men who were homosexuals during this entire wartime. And it looks at it through the view of studying the effects, particularly of shell shock, or what we today would call PTSD. As you might assume, this book covers a lot of different topics, most of which are related to medicine or psychology itself, and it gets a lot into what it means to try and fit in. That is also a major key, is like trying to fit into society and into societal expectations. The high in this whole series, and even in this book itself, was the writing and just the world and experience she created of getting you to understand what it was like to live in the UK during World War I, and particularly in England. The lows in this book for me had to do with the plot. I felt like I really just wasn't totally happy with a lot of the events that happened in the book. I felt like the plot really went in a very different direction than the first two books in the series led me to believe it was going to go. And I, of the three books, found this one to have some themes and meanings in it that, I don't know, somehow just didn't hit me as strongly as it did in the first two books. I definitely felt like book 3 was kind of a divergence from where it felt like a lot of the storylines in the series were going to go, but it did wrap them up, but I don't know, just not in a very satisfying way. So the plot was probably my least favorite thing in this book as a whole. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars, which for sure makes it the lowest rated book for me in the series. And I would recommend this particular book to someone who's a completionist. I have to admit that after having read all three books, the first book being Regeneration, the second book being Eye in the Door, and the third one being The Ghost Road, I don't know that I would say that the entire series is worth reading. I think book 1 in the series, Regeneration, is the best book in the series and actually works pretty well as a standalone. In fact, I recall at the end of reading Regeneration wondering what else could happen in the story that would lead to 2 more books. Well, I read and I found out, and I would have been fine with just book 1. So if you're interested in any part of this series, I will link in the description box below the videos where I reviewed the first 2 books in the series. And like I said, I would recommend Regeneration to anyone who likes historical fiction, doesn't mind reading historical fiction that takes place during a war, but maybe prefers it not to be about the war itself, but things that are related to the war. I think it has a very different look and scope at what goes on during wartime, and I liked the fact that it takes place during a war that I feel like isn't frequently used or talked about in historical fiction. I think other books that are similar to this are The Return of the Soldier, and that book was actually the reason that I wanted to read Regeneration, because there are some similar themes in there regarding shell shock and coming back home and just trying to deal with the fallout of being in a war that you may or may not believe in. So that was that book. Again, I wish I could say better things about book 2 and 3. I will say I did like The Eye in the Door, just not as much as Regeneration. And The Eye in the Door does sort of end somewhat open-ended, so you do feel like you have to go on to book 3. And because of that, again, like book 3, in my opinion, just wasn't worth it, even though book 3 was the book that won the Booker Award. And that just confirmed to me that I honestly think they gave book 3 the Booker Prize because they realized they should have given it to Regeneration. Like, Regeneration is hands down a better book than Ghost Road. So I don't know, there's that. Anyway, let's move on to the next book. So I didn't mention that the last book was a buddy read. I was buddy reading that with my friend Alex, and the next book I have to talk about was also a buddy read. And that book is Cautery. However, this book is a book that I buddy read with Britta Bowler, and it is another work of historical fiction. And all three of these in some ways are also like a blend of historical fiction and literary fiction. This probably felt the most literary of the three in terms of writing style. I would say this also has like a subgenre, if you will, of feminist fiction or feminist writing. There are a lot of topics in it that have to do with like just ideas that are centered on the role of women in society, both historically and in modern days. This was published in 2022. And I would describe this book as being about two split timelines taking place in both the 1600s and 2012. In the 1600s, we are following a woman named Deborah Moody, who I had never heard of, but who is the only woman to have found a village in the New World in the US. So she was the only woman who basically settled a colony in the US. So very interesting background information about like sort of colonial times in the US that I had never heard before. And 2012, we're following an unnamed narrator who has experienced a devastating breakup and is just trying to go through the motions of figuring out what she is going to do moving forward. And the 2012 timeline is actually split into 2 or 3 different timelines is kind of what it feels like, but technically I guess 2 timelines, which is before and after. So for me, the highest in this book was that I felt like it was an unflinching look at the roles of women and how women are treated, particularly by men throughout time, specifically through the 1600s up to present day. I thought that there were times where the book just flat out went into talking about how poor the treatment of women was, how men treated women, and was just very direct with it. But I didn't feel like I was necessarily reading an essay or anything like that. I feel like it spoke directly to a lot of these issues, but in a way that still fit within the story and felt believable to the story. And I think it just worked well for what it was. And there were times where I think some very good points were made. However, there were quite a few lows in this book for me. One of them had to do with the 2 points of view. I'm not somebody that's typically bothered by that. At least I don't think. I feel like of late, I've actually made that comment a lot. So maybe I don't like multiple timelines. I'd have to actually sit down and think about it. But I don't think like I flat out would avoid a book because it's told in 2 points of view. However, that was one of my least favorite things about this book. Not that it was told in 2 points of view, but that there was clearly a point of view that I liked better than the other. And it was the historical point of view. I thought that was really well done. I liked everything about how that story was told. And then there was the present day version that just felt chaotic, but not in a good way. It was hard to follow. It was non-linear. I realized way too late that I really did need to pay attention to the before and after. And by the time, or the before and now, and by the time I did that, I was kind of lost within the story, but the non-linear timeline also made it confusing. There were a lot of gaps and holes and graphic mentions of multiple content warning things that just didn't feel necessary. And I just ended up not liking that point of view. The other thing that I didn't like about the 2 points of view and how it was done in this book is that at the end of the book, there is a tie-in to how these 2 timelines were connected, and it felt very forced and like then very obvious and just out and out unnecessary the way it was done. I personally didn't like it or need it, and I did end up giving this book a very low 3 stars. It almost didn't get 3 stars for me. I would recommend this book to anyone who likes literary fiction. That may help with the second point of view. It's much more literary, I would say, in its writing style, much more like postmodern in its writing style. And so if that's something that you enjoy, you may find the second perspective of this book more enjoyable than I did. If you like nonlinear timelines, you again may like this type of book, or if you like 2 points of view. I think one of the things that did kind of help with the 2 points of view in this book is that the chapters are very short. And you do every single chapter switch which character you're in, but because the chapters are so short, if you find that there's one POV that you don't like, you're going to be back to the other one pretty quickly. So that helped me finish the book. I think if the chapters had been longer and I had to wait longer to go back to the 1600s, this could have potentially ended up as a DNF because I really was on the struggle bus with the present day point of view. The books that I could think of that remind me of this book, one I liked better and the other one I liked maybe slightly better. Probably not. So the one that I felt was very similar to this book was My Year of Rest and Relaxation. There was a lot in the present day timeline of this story that reminded me of the protagonist in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, including having the unnamed narrator, the tone and the voice of this character, and even a lot of the sort of problems that she's going through and the way the book is plotted in telling about the problems that she is having and the events of the past that she went through. The other book that this reminds me of is Liars, which I read last year, and that was the book that I like better, both than this book as well as I like it better than My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And I think the way that Liars is similar to this book and yet better is that it's still a work of literary fiction and it's still dealing with a lot of the same themes and relationship issues that this book is dealing with as a whole, particularly that this book deals with in the present timeline. However, I think Liars, like the writing is just so much easier to follow and it's more interesting and a much better paced book. So if you liked this book and you like sort of the part of this book that is talking about the issues that women have in toxic relationships, then I would definitely give Liars a try. However, if you didn't like the modern day perspective in this book, then those two recommendations may not help you out. So that's it. Those are the 3 books that I recently read. Let me know if you have read any of these 3 books and what your thoughts were on them, or if you're interested in reading any of these 3 books, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.